Hello, APUSH peeps. Today we're going over Period 3 key terms. This would be a great way to either start Period 3 or review for a summative. So let's go. First, we start with the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, which was a war between Great Britain and France with her Indian allies. In North America, the fighting was over the control of the Ohio River Valley, and which power would have control over what is the eastern half of North America. The British won this war of rising global powers, but they went into great debt to do so. For our North American British colonies, this will lead to a loss of salutary neglect, as the British will become more hands-on with governing and regulating their colonies in order to avoid war with Native Americans and extract resources and taxes. A pre-Revolutionary War development is the rise of colonial elites. These are individuals that, because of expanding trade, led to amassing considerable wealth. Generally, these are rich merchants in Boston and New York, or wealthy plantation owners in the South. These elites increasingly became connected to each other through gatherings like the Stamp Act Congress, Continental Congress, or writing to each other through the committees of correspondence. This leads to increased colonial coordination. Loyalists are American colonists who are against antagonizing the British with protest and violence. They will go on to support the British in the Revolutionary War, and while given equal rights in the Treaty of Paris, many will still go back to England. A major Loyalist figure is Thomas Hutchinson. On the other end were patriots. Most of them believed the British have unlawfully restricted natural rights and were against the British in the Revolution. There are many major figures, but some of the most prominent were Washington, Paine, Revere, Adams, Henry, and Franklin. Thomas Paine's common sense, influenced by many other revolutionary ideas in literature, like Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. In Common Sense, Paine calls for independence and a republican government. He says it is absurd for an island to rule a continent and criticizes the traditional tyrannical monarchy. His pamphlet is widely read around the colonies and written in easy-to-read and understand vernacular. The first battles of the Revolutionary War actually take place in Concord and Lexington a year before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. A British detachment based in the hotspot of revolutionary fervor, Massachusetts, went into the colony to disarm militias. Instead, the militias fought the British. A year later, the colonies formally declared independence. The war itself has many twists and turns, which we're not going to cover here. It ultimately ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and the formation of the United States. The war is a part or result of the overall American Revolution. So let's take a quick look at this. Some will say, notably John Adams, the revolution occurred before the war. He meant that the revolution was the ideas of natural rights and the American colonists identifying themselves less as British subjects and more as free Americans. The Declaration of Independence and war were a result or effect of those ideas. Others say the revolution occurs after the war when the ideas are put into practice. And we can see that with the democratic forms of government in the failed Articles of Confederation and a successful Constitution with its Bill of Rights. And still others say it is ongoing, that the U.S. has struggled to live up to its ideals laid in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. There has been continuous revolution through its history, as seen in the ending of slavery, expanding women's rights and roles, and ending segregation. The Declaration of Independence does more than break away the colonies from Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson, the author, discusses inherent inalienable rights that are not dependent on government, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and also declaring that all men are created equal. This has a strong philosophical basis in the writings of John Locke and the Enlightenment. Okay, next we have the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government. It will be short-lived, though, as it fails due to its lack of an effective centralized government. Some of the issues are there was no power to raise an army, impose taxes, or regulate commerce. It does have one success, though, and that is the Northwest Ordinance, which organizes the Northwest Territories gained in the Treaty of Paris. The ordinance outlines requirements for statehood and also bans slavery in the Northwest Territories. With the government under the Articles of Confederation not working well, leaders from across the states gathered to draft a new government under a constitution. At the drafting of this government, many issues were debated, including how the legislative branch should be organized, the relation of the national government to state governments, slavery, and the power of the executive branch. After the draft was complete, it was sent to the states for ratification. Let's get into a few details about the Constitution. It sets up three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and a power-sharing structure amongst them. There are also checks and balances. The principal author of the Constitution tried to make sure power was spread out in order to avoid tyranny, but also make a government that can function efficiently. The next major aspect of the Constitution and new government is federalism. So basically, power is shared between state governments and the federal government. Over time, the federal government has grown in power and reach, while state governments have lost power. But we still see aspects of this separation today. For example, education systems and marijuana laws. Now, let's talk about those who supported the Constitution and those who did not. The Federalists were the group that favored the Constitution and a strong central government. They wanted to limit state power and said the Senate would still support state interests. While not directly opposing the Bill of Rights, they also did not feel one was necessary. They definitely wanted to get rid of the weak Articles of Confederation, and their base of support was mostly large-scale farmers, merchants, and artisans. In general, they were also pro-British style of government, with a hierarchical structure and somewhat of a distrust of the people. On the other side were the Anti-Federalists, who opposed the Constitution and a strong central government. They supported state power and rights. Also, they said if a Constitution must be passed, at the very least, it must include a Bill of Rights. They were more open to amending the Articles than creating and passing the Constitution. In general, they want a smaller republic, or as Jefferson would call it, a yeoman farmer republic, of which their base of support was small rural farmers. Later, many of the Anti-Federalists would also be supportive of the French Revolution. So in general, both these groups agree upon having an independent country and a republic. However, they disagree on what direction America should take and the strength and power of the national government. This will lead to nasty divisions later on and ongoing debates throughout all of U.S. history about the size and role of U.S. government. Both of these groups are not political parties. However, they plant the seeds of the first two-party system of the Hamiltonian Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. Moving on to the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments were added to the Constitution shortly after its adoption. They are heavily supported by Anti-Federalists. The amendments themselves have many legal protections and civil rights. While the U.S. may have been a republic, it was not very democratic. Voting was limited to only white males with property. Property qualifications will be done away with in the 1800s, but it will be a long, slow process until the right to vote is expanded to all. The French Revolution is a major upheaval within France that will impact all of Europe and much of the world, including the United States. The revolution starts out with similar ideas to the American Revolution of doing away with monarchy and elite privileges and guaranteeing rights for all. However, it takes a turn towards violence, executions, and an overall reign of terror. Within the U.S., there is a heavy and divisive debate about where the U.S. should stand. Some felt strongly pro-French, as they identified with both the ideals of the French Revolution and the U.S. owed the French for support, as they supported the U.S. Revolution. Others, notably Hamilton, will be anti-French and regard the Revolution and terror as the exact thing the U.S. was trying to prevent with a stronger federal government. The Hamiltonians will regard the British model as more stable. The now President Washington will try to take a middle approach and declare neutrality, and the U.S. would only act to protect its economic interests. Washington's famous farewell address, a staple of many AP U.S. history tests. Washington decides to not seek a third term as president, thereby setting an important precedent. Before he leaves, though, he gives an increasingly divided country words of wisdom in his farewell address, of which all of it will not be followed at some point. He says to stay out of European conflicts, which America will do until the 20th century. Washington warns against forming political parties because that will lead to more division. However, that happens immediately after Washington is gone. Finally, and this goes along with the political parties warning, is to not become divided by regional interests. And we know this will be a major hallmark of the 1800s, with divisions over tariffs and especially slavery. So great advice, but not followed. Speaking of political parties, let's take a look at the first two. Starting with the Hamiltonian Federalists, they favor a strong federal government, a national bank, tariffs to support a manufacturing economy, and good relations with Great Britain, not Green Bay, which does not exist yet. And I don't think Hamilton would have been a Packers fan. Seems more like a Giants fan. I think Jefferson would have more appreciated the Packers. Small town team owned by a group of regular shareholders. Anyways, the Jeffersonian Democrats were founded by their namesake, Jefferson, and buddy James Madison. In general, there is a clear link to the Anti-Federalists here. They favor states' rights, less federal government, oppose the national bank, and are pro-French. There is kind of a key switch here, though, and that is Madison, who authored the Constitution, now joining the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Okay, let's run a few pieces of key info from the 1790s. Try to view these through the lens of the Federalists and Republicans. A lot of College Board questions like to ask how those two camps view these events. So the first one we're going to cover is Jay's Treaty, and how that attempts to resolve lingering issues with the British, including removing the British from the Northwest Territories, ending the impressment of American sailors, and working out some debt issues. The Federalists cheered the treaty, while the Republicans, especially Secretary of State Jefferson, were very critical of it. I want to briefly run through some key events from Adams' tumultuous one-term presidency. First, the XYZ affair, which was a foreign relations debacle. It was made public that American diplomats were to pay a French official a bribe for international relations. Coming after the uproar of the XYZ affair, a quasi or undeclared war with France occurred. This was a result of poor relations between the US and France. The war itself was a short-lived naval war with France. But again, circling back to the Federalists and Republicans, those in the Republican camp were aghast that the Adams administration led America into a conflict with France, who Republicans felt we should be allies with. Then came the Alien Act, which was aimed at restricting activities for non-citizens, specifically French revolutionaries who were stirring up trouble in the US. The act allowed the government to expel foreigners easily and change requirements for citizenship to 14 years residing in the US from 5 years. Finally, was the highly controversial Sedition Act, a new law that outlawed any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the President, and made it illegal to conspire to oppose any measure or measures of the government. Federalists agree with most of these measures, while Jeffersonian Republicans vehemently disagree with all of these measures. So now let's look at the Republican response to all of those acts that they did not like, which was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions stated that states had the right to nullify federal laws they deem unconstitutional. This idea of nullification will live a long life and come up again in the 1800s with tariffs and slavery. The Hamiltonians and others would point to the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, thus leaving the resolutions null and void. Okay, last term, and a topic we have not spent enough time on, and that is women's roles. So European and colonial society were very patriarchal, and the US will very much stay a patriarchy, with women having their subordinate sphere and be relegated to the cult of domesticity. However, an idea of Republican motherhood springs up, which somewhat elevates the social status of women. It is the idea that now that the United States is its own country, and it's a republic, with its citizens playing a vital role, women need to teach children, especially their sons, to be good Republican citizens, to be engaged in a new democratic society, in which they have many freedoms and decisions they can make. Aside from the importance of education, it generally does not shift the American mindset of gender equality, in which society was highly unequal for women, who are not afforded many of the rights in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. Okay, that does it for Period 3 terms. Subscribe to the channel for more AP US History Simplified videos.